allow me to introduce you to the love child of Settlers of Catan and Forbidden Island. Quite the accomplishment, really, when you consider neither of those games was born when this one was. Nevertheless, this is... hang on, title's on here somewhere. Survive.
I have here the original version as published by Parker Brothers in 1982. As it happens, there exists another game, published a few years later, entitled Escape from Atlantis. The only key differences appear to be Atlantis has fewer tiles, and the people you're trying to save aren't worth points. Now, I'm not sure whether Atlantis is just that, a different game with similar rules, or if it's actually a revamp of Survive, but either way, the publisher Stronghold Games released a reprint in 2011 which basically merged the two games under the rather imaginative title Survive! Escape from Atlantis. The reprint is essentially Survive, but with some extra pieces added so you can play the game under the Atlantis rule set. The cover art for this version is actually doubly effective. Apart from just being nicely illustrated overall, it also shows all the key points of how the game works without beating you over the head with it. As brilliantly colorful as the cover art may be, however, it's brought down a bit by the image on the other side. Just a bland black and white picture of the game's board and pieces.
Speaking of those pieces, let's have a look at them, shall we? And while this may be the original version of the game and therefore lack the pieces for Escape from Atlantis, that's not to say it doesn't have extra pieces. I'll show you what I mean in a bit, but first, let's take a look at the board.
For the most part, the design of the board is about as effective as the illustration of the box it's kept in, showing a grid of hexagonal spaces on which your tokens will move, with a group of spaces outlined in the middle to indicate where you'll build the main island. The 4 islands in the corner, where you eventually want to have all your people tokens, look nice as well, but their pleasant aesthetic is, for me anyway, also a bit problematic.
They could almost be mistaken for simple background detailing. Now, it says explicitly in the instructions that these 4 islands are where you need to go, so I'm not implying that there could be confusion as to their purpose. I do think, however, that for an end goal, I don't know, something's missing. I feel like it could have used just a tiny little extra touch somewhere to firmly designate, yes, that's where you need to go. So now, let's move on to the individual pieces, and while they do their jobs well enough, I've got my gripes with them.
First, you have 40 hexagonal tiles with which you'll build the main island. These are double-sided, with one side showing either a beach, forest, or mountain, and the other containing either an image of some kind or a message.
The tiles are also a bit small, which can lead to some frustrations both when putting the island together and when trying to remove some of the tiles, especially if you're like me and your hands aren't always that steady. But I think my frustration comes not merely from the fact that it's small, but they're also thin, like nearly paper thin. As such, there's really not all that much to grab onto, so you either have to grab onto it like a claw and hope that your fingers don't slip and send tiles everywhere, or just kind of put your thumb on one side and lift the other and risk bending it. Let me give you a bit of a comparison.
Here's a Survive land tile along with one from Settlers of Catan. Note the Catan tile is not only roughly twice the size of the Survive tile, but also about twice the thickness, and thus is much easier to handle. Now here it is with the tile from Forbidden Island. Again, the Forbidden Island tile is bigger and thicker, with the added bonus that in that game, there's a space between each tile, making it easy to grab a tile and flip it or remove it.
I guess my point is, with the way Survive works, I can understand why the tiles had to be this size. I mean, if they were Catan sized, the main island alone would take up the whole table. But I just don't see why they couldn't have been a little bit thicker. And maybe a tiny bit bigger as well.
And that leads me to the boats, something else that could stand to borrow one of Mario's mushrooms. The boats are your main method for transporting your people to the safe harbor islands. They have just enough room on them for up to 3 people tokens, and I mean just enough room. And if you have a boat filled to capacity, good luck trying to turn it around and slide it on the board without accidentally knocking somebody over.
And while we're talking about the people, let's talk about the people. The game includes 40 people tokens in 4 sets of 10. And if you have the original version like me, you get to enjoy the brilliant color variety of purple, red, orange, and yellow. Yeah, suffice to say, if you're playing this game with more than 2 people, it can get a little hard on the eyes. What makes it worse is that each people token is worth anywhere from 1 to 6 points. How can you tell which is which? The number is molded on the bottom of each people token in the exact same color. You know, normally I try to keep my antiques as untouched as possible, but I think in this one instance, I may end up taking a silver Sharpie to these things.
Lastly, you have sea serpent, whale, and shark tokens, 5 each of the first 2 and 6 of the latter. The more observant among you are probably noticing something a bit off right about now.
Remember how I said the game had extra pieces? Here they are. 1 extra token for each sea creature. Now you're probably thinking, wow, you just got that from a Goodwill or something. Somebody just threw some extra pieces in there and didn't even think about it. And you're kinda right, I did get this from a thrift store, so that is entirely possible. But here's the thing. Whoever had this game before me evidently never touched it at all, because when I got it, all the pieces were still sealed. The game was sold with the extra pieces. And it's not just a quirk of my particular copy either.
There's a version of this game available to play on Tabletop Simulator, and even there you can see the extra pieces. It's just such an odd discrepancy to find. Why not just list the actual number of sea creature tokens instead of counting 1 short and leaving people to scratch their heads? Oh, and one other thing to note about the Tabletop Simulator version of the game. Whoever made it had the brilliant presence of mind to make the people tokens red, green, blue, and purple, and made the numbers on the bottom white on black text. I don't know if that was a carryover from Escape from Atlantis, but either way, it was a much welcome change if you ask me.
But enough blabbing about pieces. How do you play this thing? Well, Survive is one of those games where the rules sound incredibly complicated when you first read them, but when you actually get down to playing it, it's really very simple. First, there's a little bit of preparation involved.
To begin setting it up, you place all 5, not 6, that's what the instructions say, all 5 sea serpents onto the specially marked spaces on the board. The extra one just stays in the box. You know, maybe they put in extra pieces in case you lose one. That would make sense. But then, why wouldn't they tell you that? Why not just say in the instructions we put in extra pieces in case your dumbass loses one? I don't know, let's just move on. Then, once you've placed all the sea serpents on the board, you shuffle all the land tiles and begin placing them within the outlined area on the board.
For reasons I'll get into later, when placing the tiles, you want to make sure you don't have any beach tiles surrounded by forest or mountain tiles, or any forest tiles surrounded by mountain tiles.
Next, each player selects a set of people tokens and places them in front of him, along with 2 boats. The sharks, whales, and the rest of the boats remain off to the side for now. Once you've done the setup, you're ready to get ready to play.
What the hell's the difference?
In the apparently distinctly different from the setup getting ready to play phase, you choose a player to go first, with play proceeding to the left. On each player's turn, he places a people token number side down on an unoccupied land space, taking care not to let the other players see the number. Not that that's all that possible with these tokens.
Once you've placed a people token down, you may not reveal its point value until the end of the game, even if it gets eliminated before then. When all players have placed their tokens, you may then begin placing your boats. In the same manner, 1 per turn going clockwise around the board. Once all players have placed their people tokens and their boats, you are finally ready to actually play the game. Each player's turn consists of 3 phases. The first of which involves moving one of your people tokens and or a boat that you control. Now, moving your people is simple enough, you just pick it up and move. Though it should be noted that once a people token has left the island, it can't return. But what about boats? How do you control them? Well, you can do so in one of 3 ways. Firstly, by having a majority of the people tokens on a boat be your color, in which case you retain control so long as you retain that majority. For instance, if it's this red guy's turn, he can't move this boat so long as I have my 2 yellow guys on it. You can also control a boat if it has no color majority, or if it's completely empty. In either case, you only control it during your turn. Also, there can only be 1 boat in a sea space at a time. So, knowing all that, during your movement phase, you can take 3 actions which can consist of any combination of things. You can move 1 person 3 spaces. You can move 1 boat 3 spaces. You can move 3 people 1 space each. You can move 1 person onto a boat and then move that boat 2 spaces. Basically, you can do any number of things with your 3 movement actions, but while keeping in mind that your eventual goal is to get all of your people tokens onto the safe harbor islands. Now, there is another subset of movement rules that I haven't touched on yet, and that involves swimmers.
A people token can become a swimmer by either jumping from a land tile into an adjoining sea space, jumping from a boat into the same sea space, or if they happen to be on a land tile that sinks. Swimmers can only move one sea space per turn, and the act of jumping into the sea counts as one move. You can have a swimmer climb into a boat, but only if they're in the same space. So if a boat and a swimmer are in two adjacent spaces, it would actually take 2 turns to get the swimmer into the boat. And unlike boats, multiple swimmers can occupy the same sea space.
With the movement phase done, you move on to the second phase, sinking a land tile, which you do in a very specific order.
At first, you can only sink beach tiles. Once the beach tiles are gone, you can start sinking the forest tiles, and with all of them gone, you sink the mountain tiles. Also, you can only sink a tile that has at least one side touching the water.
Once you've sunk a tile, you take a look at the underside, which will have either a message or an image of some kind printed on it.
Messages can involve moving one of the sea creatures on the board, or moving one of your people or boats, in which case you keep it and play it at the beginning of a later turn. If you have multiple messages, you can only play one per turn. Or will either say kill a shark or harpoon a whale. These can be played at any time during the game to protect your people tokens from being eliminated by the appropriate creature. Once a message is played, it is removed from the game.
Pictures, unlike messages, are played immediately upon taking the tile, and once played, are removed from the game. The picture can either be of a shark or a whale, in which case you place the appropriate creature in the sea space where that tile was, eliminating any swimmers or boats with people in them in the process. Or you may just get lucky and find a picture of a boat, in which case you place a boat where that tile was and any people that were on it automatically board the boat. Or you might just find a whirlpool. If you flip this over, you eliminate everything, any sea creature, boat, person, swimmer or otherwise, that was on that sea space or any of the sea spaces touching its 6 sides. Adjacent land tiles and the people on them are unaffected. There's one more picture you can find, but I'll talk about that later. The third and final phase involves moving one of the sea creatures on the board, which you do with this die, which has 2 icons each of the sea serpent, shark, and whale. You roll the die and move the appropriate creature. If there's more than one of it on the board, you move only one, and if there's none of that creature on the board, you simply do nothing.
Each of the 3 sea creatures has its own set of rules for how far it can move and what it can attack, which you can keep track of with a chart found on opposite sides of the board. Whales are the fastest of the 3 sea creatures, being able to move up to 3 sea spaces per turn. They attack manned boats, meaning if a whale lands in a sea space with a boat that has people on it, the boat is removed from the game, and the people on it become swimmers, assuming no one plays a harpoon a whale tile, in which case the whale is removed instead.
The swimmers themselves are perfectly safe and can occupy a sea space with a whale no problem. The same goes for boats with no one aboard.
Sharks are a little bit slower, only moving up to 2 sea spaces per turn. Boats, whether manned or not, can safely occupy a sea space with a shark, but if it lands in a sea space with one or more swimmers, they are eliminated, again unless someone has a kill a shark tile handy.
Because of their attack rules, the shark and the whale could be used to make an effective 1-2 punch against a boat and its crew in one go. Because sure, a manned boat can occupy the same sea space with a shark with no problems, but if a whale ends up there as well, he takes out the boat, which makes the crew become swimmers, which then becomes shark food.
Then there's the sea serpent. They are by far the most powerful of the 3, being able to attack manned boats and swimmers alike.
And if a sea serpent attacks you, ain't no protection from that. You be dead.
This power, however, comes at the cost of movement. The sea serpent can only move 1 sea space per turn. And for those wondering, yes, the monsters appear to be on friendly terms with each other, as the instructions specifically state they cannot be used to attack each other, but they can be in the same sea space together.
Now, it may just come to pass that you have no more people to move, either through saving them all, or losing them all, or a combination thereof. This doesn't remove you from the game, however. It merely does away with the movement phase of your turn. You can still use your turn to sink land tiles or move monster tokens. And personally, I like it when a game keeps you involved like that, and you're not just sitting back waiting for the other players to save their people or kill each other trying. So that's the gist of the game. Try to get your people to safety while avoiding the denizens of the deep along the way. Sounds dangerous enough, right? Except that there's another hazard, in the form of a pseudo-time limit. Remember I mentioned there was another image among the undersides of the tiles? That's found specifically on one of the mountain tiles. A volcano erupting. Flip this over, and you remove all the remaining land pieces on the board, in the process eliminating basically anything that isn't on a safe harbor island and ending the game.
Once the game ends, you collect any of your people tokens that you manage to get to safety and add up their point value, and the player with the most points wins.
For as much as I griped and nitpicked about the individual bits and pieces that make up the gameplay itself is actually pretty solid, and I could only really think of maybe one or two minor concerns with the game. Firstly, what happens if the game ends in a tie?
The people that wrote the manual don't seem to have thought of that situation, as the instructions mention nothing about ties. And I'll grant you, as more monsters get added to the board and you start finding whirlpools, the situation is very unlikely, but it could just be possible if you're playing with only 2 or even 3 players that you get all your people tokens to safety.
And even if you didn't, it could still turn out that the point total of the people tokens that you did manage to save is equal. So what happens then? Does the game just end in a draw? Who knows? Also, don't get me wrong, the way the game works, well, works. I like it, I really do. But as my friends and I played this game, I started thinking of ways to change it up a little, just to improve the replayability just a little bit. For instance, with the different messages and images located on the other side of the tiles, you'll eventually get an idea for how long the game is going to last, especially with the volcano, the game-ending tile, being located on the mountain tiles, one of the last pieces of the game to be sunk. So I figured instead of having the messages and the images be on the other side of the tiles, what if you could, say, have 2 decks of cards, sort of Monopoly style, and one of them could say draw an instruction, in which case you take a message tile or a card, and the other could say maybe play an event, in which case you play an image. Alternatively, you could have a second die to represent the 3 land types, and during the sinking phase you just roll that to determine which tile gets sunk. Now, I don't have Escape from Atlantis or Survive Escape from Atlantis, so I can't speak to how they compare with the original in terms of enjoyment, but they do seem to be doing quite well for themselves, with expansions being released as recently as 2015. You can find copies of the original on sites like Amazon and eBay for anywhere from $30 to $45, and at that price, I'd absolutely recommend grabbing it. Aside from being an interesting look into the origins of the Stronghold line, it's also just good fun as well. And so ends another glimpse into board game Obscura. I hope you enjoyed it, and that you'll join me next time. Chikai made. Sayonara.